Howdy ESSM 406. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to the key idea of some of the design principles. So in the last lecture, I said that people had taken these ideas from Garrett Hardin and realized they didn't work. They found that there were communities that were managing their resources successfully without either state intervention or private property rights being imposed from the outside. And Ostrom studied many examples of this. I've given you some readings, some of the examples from her book. She talks about water management in Southern California, a situation analogous to the situations many of you are studying here in Texas with overpumping of groundwater. She shows that people in California were able to solve this problem, and it's not like the state of California came in and imposed a solution. They actually figured it out themselves. I'm also giving you a reading by Arun Agrawal where he talks about a similar situation with the management of forests in Nepal. Many international experts thought that the state had to manage the forest to be sustainable, but actually once the state opened up and allowed communities to manage the forest themselves, they actually became more sustainable. And then in the reading by Andrews and Jansen, there's actually many different examples of this. So you have lots of examples to work with of situations where communities can come together to manage their resources. And you can think about whether in the case you're studying, this could be a potential. Maybe in some cases this is already happening, or in some cases maybe this could happen. Maybe communities could work together. So Ostrom found some commonalities in what makes these work. And there's 8 design principles. These are listed in page 72 of the reading by Andrews and Jansen. And you can also find them written up in other places, but this is a nice summary. And I just wanted to briefly, in a very short video, run through these and explain to you how these interconnect. The first idea is that for resources to be well managed, you need to have clearly defined boundaries. You need to know who's using the resource and where the resource begins and ends. You can imagine that this may be more difficult in some situations. So the classic example, open ocean fisheries, kind of anyone can come and use them. It's not really clear where the fish breed. We can't see the fish. So that tends to be a very difficult situation to manage, whereas, say, a forest near a community, people can see who's walking into the forest. We can all agree where the boundaries of the forest are. That might be a little bit easier. Then there has to be a fit between the rules that are used and the local conditions. One of the problems with a government imposing a rule is that it may not work for the local situations. And there's not like one set of rules that's the best set of rules. In different places, we find that different communities have devised different kinds of restrictions on their use. Second is the community needs to make rules, needs to be able to make their own rules. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that everyone in the community makes their own rules. We've actually found there can be some inequality and still have a sustainable system. But many people in the community need access to the process of rulemaking. And one of the reasons this is really important is because if something isn't working right and there's no one who kind of can communicate that, one of the problems with a lot of top-down government management is that the government officials don't actually know what's happening on the ground. There's just not enough of them. But the people who are using the resource every day have a lot of information. So if they have access to that decision-making authority and they see something isn't working, they might be able to make a change. Another thing is monitoring. And by monitoring, I mean something different than what you've probably learned about in some of your more ecologically minded classes. Although ecological monitoring is important, what we find really important is monitoring the people who actually use the resource. So making sure that everyone's following the same rules. So you can think about an irrigation system where no one monitors that the people take the water they're allocated. Well, one person might take all the water and not be enough left for everyone. So you need to have a system which everyone can monitor each other, or whether they hire a guard to make sure that everyone is following the rules. And there needs to be sanctioning mechanisms, so people who break the rules need to be punished. But often we find that in these very successful systems, the punishment for breaking the rule once is not very severe. Because maybe some people, we don't want to just drive everyone out, right? But when people are repeated rule breakers, then they get sanctioned very severely. So Ostrom talks about there being a need for graduated sanctions. The last two relate to kind of the larger sphere. So there needs to be conflict resolution mechanisms. If the people using the resource come into conflict, they need to be able to resolve their differences. Sometimes this can happen through negotiations, but actually sometimes in the case that Ostrom discusses in the reading I gave you about groundwater management in Southern California, they actually resolved their differences through the court system. It took a long time and was costly, but they were able to resolve their differences. Then they need recognition of their rights to organize. This is something that's very important, particularly in developing countries. Oftentimes, the local people are very looked down upon. The government may feel like they don't have the ability to make these decisions. Their local organizations that may have existed for generations may not be recognized. And there's a famous example that Ostrom talked about. In Nepal, there were these traditional irrigation systems that had been around for hundreds of years, which people had built little canals to channel the irrigation water from little rivers to, to water their rice fields. And the government came in and said, well, this is very inefficient. These canals leak. They don't have the best modern technology. They're losing water from the canals. And they put in all of these very fancy modern concrete canals that were much more efficient, steel gates. But they didn't recognize that a big problem with irrigation is just getting the people to cooperate and monitor each other. And so although the government was imposing all these systems, they didn't recognize the rights of people to manage their own resources. And those systems, although the technology was better, the institutions, the rules, were not as good. And so they were outperformed by these very traditional systems that had much worse technology, but much better human organization. And finally, we often find that in efficient large-scale systems, there's kind of a nested approach. So that means maybe there's one area, one decision-making arena for the very local. Again, the irrigation canals are a good example because sometimes you have very large irrigation systems. Everyone who's on one branch of the canal may make decisions, but they still have to interact with the people who manage the entire canal system because during a drought, there may not be enough water for every canal. So those are the 8 design principles. And it's important to recognize it's not like you have to have every one of these in place, but these are common characteristics of community managed systems that have been shown to be sustainable in the long run. So if you were going to create a solution for the community, you might think about, well, how are they going to monitor their resource? What kind of sanctions are they going to pose? What's going to be their arena that they're going to use to make decisions and resolve conflicts? These are some of the key decisions that you might want to make if you want to make sure that a community system is sustainable.